Well, ASX has actually been in New Zealand this week, meeting with prospective listings and also hosting an event to provide a compliance update for those companies that are already listed on the ASX. And we do know that New Zealand is a target jurisdiction for the ASX in terms of new listings. The purpose of listing in any market is ultimately to enable a company to have better access to capital for growth. For New Zealand companies, listing on the ASX as well as on the NZX means that they have access to a greater pool of capital in the form of Australian institutional investors. In fact, a recent study showed that 42 of the top investors in Australia required a company to have an ASX listing before they were capable, under their investment mandates, to invest in that company. This has been a trend we've been seeing largely in relation to smaller cap New Zealand companies, and I think the reason that they choose to list solely on the ASX is that they perceive that there will be less regulation involved. That's not in fact the case. For a New Zealand incorporated company that chooses to list solely on the ASX, they must comply for any corporate action with New Zealand company and securities law because they're New Zealand incorporated, and also with the ASX listing rules. That means that any corporate action that such a company chooses to take requires advice typically from both their New Zealand and Australian advisors, which isn't in fact cost effective. Almost all of the New Zealand companies that have chosen to list solely on the ASX would have been able to qualify as a foreign exempt listing on the ASX. That means that they would have had their primary listing on NZX instead and then listed in Australia as a foreign exempt listing. That means they only have to comply with the New Zealand regulatory regime. There is no additional regulatory obligation, but they still gain access to that greater pool of capital in Australia. The other thing to bear in mind is that New Zealand is obviously a smaller market, and being a smaller company listed on a smaller market means you're more likely to get investor attention. In fact, if you were a company with a $100 million market cap and you listed on the NZX, you'd sit at around the 100 mark in terms of the list of companies. On the ASX, in comparison, you'd be sitting at over the 2,000 mark. Being a minnow in a large market like the ASX does present challenges for listed companies, and it's telling that all of the New Zealand companies that chose to list solely on the ASX have had poor share price performance post-IPO. For New Zealand-based companies, where their workforce is predominantly based in New Zealand, it helps to create a culture of ownership if those employees can see a New Zealand-listed share price in New Zealand dollars. And this makes participation by those employees in employment incentive schemes, for example, far easier. New Zealand also has a far more permissive regulatory regime in terms of the ability to raise capital once a company is listed through our quoted financial products exclusion. For companies that are listed on the ASX, they can't take advantage of this exclusion, which means that capital raisings cannot be extended to New Zealand retail investors unless they are already shareholders, without the need for full disclosure documentation.